You bought the entire building just to evict one girl? The billionaire didn't even look up from the contract folder when he answered, not just a girl. The last tenant. Laughter rippled across the marble lobby where investors stood admiring the property they believed would soon become another luxury tower. She has no money, no leverage, and no chance, one attorney said casually. But the quiet maintenance girl standing near the service elevator didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply watched them celebrate her eviction like it was already finished. Because the powerful people in that lobby had missed something. Something buried inside a document none of them had bothered to read carefully. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What nobody in that room understood yet was simple. Buildings remember the people who created them, and sometimes the quiet girl sweeping the floors knows the truth hidden in their bones. Victor Halbrecht finally closed the folder and looked toward the service corridor. His expensive suit moved like armor as he stepped closer to the girl everyone wanted gone. "You're the holdout, right?" he asked. The young woman nodded once. Mara Ionescu didn't raise her voice. She stood with grease on her gloves and a wrench tucked into her belt, calm enough that it irritated him. Behind her, the service hallway smelled faintly of detergent and rusted pipes. Luxury investors watched from the lobby, curious how long the stubborn tenant would last. Everyone else took the buyout. Victor continued, "You could have walked away with more money than this place is worth." Mara glanced briefly toward the stairwell where her little brother waited. Leo sat quietly on the steps holding a worn backpack. The building was the only home he could remember. She turned back to the billionaire. "This building isn't for sale to me," she said softly. Victor smirked. "Everything is for sale." The lobby lights reflected across polished stone as his lawyers approached. Claudine Voss carried the eviction notice like a victory flag. "Miss Ionescu," she said, extending the document. "You have 72 hours to vacate the property." Leo shifted on the stairs, confused but silent. Mara accepted the paper. Her fingers were steady. That calm expression again unsettled Victor. Most people argued, most people panicked. She only folded the notice once and slipped it into her pocket. "You understand the deadline?" Claudine asked. Mara nodded. "I understand." The billionaire gave a satisfied breath. Problem solved, he thought. Investors resumed discussing rooftop pools and glass penthouses. But while the powerful people celebrated, the girl walked quietly back toward the service corridor. The hallway lights hummed overhead. Leo looked up at her. "Are we leaving?" he whispered. She crouched beside him. "Not yet, but he owns the building." Mara glanced down the corridor toward an old metal door-marked archive. Dust lived there. So did history. She rested her hand on the boy's shoulder. "People think ownership is simple," she murmured. "Paper, money, signatures." Leo frowned. "Isn't it?" She looked back toward the bright lobby where Victor Halbrecht shook hands with investors. Then she reached into her worn tool bag. Inside sat a long cardboard tube. Its edges were frayed from years of careful keeping. She slid the cap loose. Old blueprints whispered softly as they moved. Leo's eyes widened. "Dad's drawings?" Mara nodded slowly. The paper smelled like dust and engine oil. Lines of steel beams and hidden supports crossed the page. At the bottom rested a familiar signature. Their father's. She rolled the blueprint closed again. Calm returned to her expression. "If he wants this building," she said quietly, "he'll have to understand it." Leo tilted his head. "Understand what?" She looked toward the marble lobby again. Victor's laughter echoed down the corridor. She slipped the blueprint tube back into the bag. That this place was designed with more than walls. Leo blinked. "What else?" Mara stood slowly. Her voice stayed calm. A promise. The hallway hummed quietly around them. Far away, investors toasted the future demolition. None of them noticed the girl walking toward the archive door. None of them realized the building's past was about to speak. The metal handle felt cold beneath her fingers. Dust drifted when the door opened. Inside waited shelves of forgotten records. Leo followed quietly. She stepped into the dim room and placed the blueprint tube carefully on a wooden table. Her eyes moved across boxes labeled decades old. Somewhere here was the document her father once mentioned. The clause nobody believed still mattered. She drew a slow breath. "Let's find it," she whispered. Behind them, the lobby applause echoed again. But tonight, the building itself seemed to listen. And for the first time since Victor Halbrecht arrived, the quiet girl smiled. The quiet smile hadn't fully faded from Mara's face when Leo whispered, "What exactly are we looking for?" Dust floated through the thin beam of light spilling from a cracked ceiling fixture. The archive room smelled like old paper, rust, and something faintly metallic, like the bones of the building itself. "Contracts," she said softly. Leo stepped closer to the table where the blueprint tube rested. "From Dad?" "Maybe," she replied. Outside the room, the marble lobby still buzzed with investors. Their voices echoed faintly through the ventilation ducts, excited and confident. Victor Halbrecht's laughter traveled farther than the others. It sounded like victory. Inside the archive, Mara carefully opened a filing box stamped with the fading date, 1998 construction records. The cardboard creaked. Stacks of yellowed documents leaned against each other like tired books. Leo crouched beside her. "Did Dad really build this place?" "He designed it," she corrected gently. "Every beam, every load column, every pipe that runs under our feet." Leo blinked. "Then why are we fixing leaks and boilers?" She paused for a moment. Some answers were too heavy for a 10-year-old. "Because the world forgets people sometimes," she said quietly. The boy frowned but didn't argue. She slid out a thick folder labeled Structural Agreements. Her fingers brushed the paper carefully. It felt familiar. Not because she remembered reading it before, but because she remembered watching her father write things like this late at night. Long hours. Cold coffee. Stacks of calculations. He used to say buildings were like living creatures. "They breathe," he'd tell her. "Treat them right and they'll stand longer than we will." Leo tilted his head as she scanned the pages. "Do you see it?" "Not yet." The building groaned faintly somewhere above them. Pipes shifting, air moving through old ducts. A place with memories. Mara flipped another page. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. Then a voice echoed down the hallway outside. "Where is she?" "Victor." Leo stiffened immediately. Mara closed the folder halfway and listened. Claudine Voss answered him somewhere beyond the archive door. "Maintenance corridor, that's where the tenant usually works." Victor's tone carried irritation. She had her moment. "Now I want her gone." Leo's hand tightened on Mara's sleeve. "They're coming." She placed the folder back into the box slowly. "No panic," she whispered. Footsteps approached, sharp heels, expensive shoes. Mara stood and brushed dust from her gloves. The archive door creaked open. Victor Halbrecht filled the doorway like a storm cloud wrapped in designer fabric. Behind him stood Claudine and two investors who looked uncomfortable being anywhere near a maintenance hallway. Victor's eyes moved across the dusty room. "You hiding now?" he asked. Mara leaned lightly against the table. "Working." His gaze dropped to the boxes. "Looking for something valuable?" "History." He gave a short laugh. "History doesn't pay property taxes." Leo shifted behind her. Victor noticed him then. "That your kid?" "My brother." Victor nodded slightly. "Then you should think about his future." Claudine stepped forward with a tight smile. You've received the eviction notice. The timeline is very clear. Mara folded her arms loosely. Yes. And yet, you're still here, obviously. Victor sighed, patience thinning. You don't understand how this works. He gestured vaguely toward the floors above them. This building will be luxury residences in 6 months. Mara glanced up at the ceiling. Not unless the structure can handle the changes. One of the investors raised an eyebrow. Victor looked amused. You a structural engineer now? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down and picked up the blueprint tube. The cardboard edges were worn smooth. Victor watched curiously. What's that? Old drawings? Souvenirs? Something like that, he smirked. Let me give you some advice. He stepped closer, voice lowering slightly. People like you don't win fights like this. Leo's eyes flashed with anger. But Mara's expression didn't change. Calm, unshakable. Victor shook his head. You could have taken the buyout. That was generous. Generous isn't the word I'd use. He turned slightly to the investors. This is what stubborn looks like. They chuckled politely. Victor gestured toward the exit. You've got 72 hours. Then he paused. Oh, and the utilities might be spotty tonight. Claudine cleared her throat. Construction preparation. Leo whispered, You're turning off the heat? Victor shrugged. Progress requires inconvenience. Mara studied him carefully. Then she nodded once. Understood. Victor frowned slightly, again with the calm. No fear, no argument, just acceptance. It unsettled him. He turned toward the hallway. Let's go. The investors followed quickly, clearly eager to return to the bright marble lobby. Claudine lingered a moment. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the blueprint tube. You won't find anything useful down here, she said quietly. Then she left. The archive door closed. Silence returned. Leo exhaled hard. They're trying to scare us. Yes, so what do we do? Mara slowly reopened the folder she'd been studying. Dust lifted again as the paper moved. We keep looking. Leo watched her flip through more pages. Minutes passed. Then something unusual caught her eye. A thin sheet tucked between 2 larger contracts, handwritten. Her father's signature rested at the bottom. Her pulse slowed. She slid the paper free. What is it? Leo asked. Mara studied the words carefully. A clause. A very specific clause. Her quiet smile returned. Something interesting, she said. Before she could read further, she looked up at Leo. By the way, if you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe with the bell on, because what happens next is something that Billionaire definitely didn't expect. Leo blinked. What does it say? Mara carefully rolled the blueprint tube open beside the document. The lines matched, the signatures matched, and suddenly the eviction notice in her pocket felt very different. She leaned back slowly. He bought the building, she murmured. Leo nodded. Yeah. Mara tapped the clause with one finger. But he didn't read the fine print. Leo leaned closer. What fine print? Her smile grew just a little wider. The part that changes everything. Leo stared at the document like it might suddenly burst into flames. What does it mean? He whispered. Mara didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved across the page again, slower this time. The handwriting was unmistakable, clean, deliberate strokes she had watched her father write thousands of times at the kitchen table. The clause was short, only 4 sentences. But every word carried weight. Leo leaned closer, curiosity bubbling over. Can we stay? Mara rolled the blueprint gently beside the paper. The old ink lines aligned perfectly with the structural notes in the contract. Maybe, she said quietly. Maybe. Leo groaned softly. That's not a good answer. She smiled faintly. It's a careful one. Above them, the building hummed with activity. Somewhere on the upper floors, heavy footsteps echoed. Metal clang. A power drill whined briefly before stopping. Victor's construction crew had already started preparing the place for demolition. Leo heard it too. They're already breaking stuff. Mara listened to the vibrations moving through the walls. They're testing the structure. Is that bad? It depends on what they think they're doing. She folded the clause carefully and slid it back into the folder. The paper was fragile. Time had thinned it like old leaves. Leo watched her tuck the document into the blueprint tube. So, we just show it to him? She shook her head slowly. No. Why not? Because people like Victor Halbrecht don't believe things quietly. Leo frowned. What does that mean? It means, she said softly, standing up, he'll only listen when he can't ignore it. The boy tried to follow the logic, but the adult world rarely made sense. So, when do we show him? Mara slung the blueprint tube over her shoulder. When everyone else is watching, Leo's eyes widened. You mean like in front of people? Exactly. He grinned suddenly. That's going to make him mad. Mara opened the archive doors slowly. The hallway outside was darker now. Only emergency lights glowed along the concrete walls. Victor's crew had already begun shutting down parts of the building. Leo shivered. It's colder. Utilities, Mara murmured. Remember what he said. They walked down the corridor toward the stairs. The faint echo of voices drifted from the lobby again. Victor was still entertaining investors. Leo peeked around the corner when they reached the end of the hall. The marble lobby gleamed under bright chandeliers. Men in tailored suits studied large digital screens showing sleek renderings of future luxury apartments. Glass towers, infinity pools, private sky lounges. None of them resembled the old building they were standing inside. Victor stood near the center of the crowd like a king in his court. Demolition begins in 2 weeks, he was saying confidently. Leo tugged Mara's sleeve. 2 weeks? She watched the crowd quietly. That's the plan. And the clause stops it? It might. Why might again? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the investors' faces. Powerful people, important people, the kind of witnesses that made truth impossible to bury. Then she turned away. Let's check the boiler room. Leo blinked. The boiler room? If the heat goes off tonight, the pipes will freeze, but we might stop the demolition. That doesn't help if the building floods first. Leo sighed but followed her. They descended the narrow maintenance stairs. The air grew warmer with each level. The boiler room door groaned open. Inside, the old machinery rattled and breathed like some enormous metal animal. Steam hissed from a pipe near the ceiling. Mara immediately crossed the room and twisted a valve. The hiss softened. Leo watched her move with quick certainty. You really do know this building better than anyone. She wiped her hands on a rag. I grew up in it. No, I mean like how you know where everything is, she shrugged. When you live somewhere long enough, you listen. Leo leaned against a metal railing. Dad used to say that. Yes. The boiler hummed louder for a moment, then settled into a steady rhythm. Leo kicked lightly at the concrete floor. You think Victor's scared of losing the building? Mara considered the question. No. Why not? Because he doesn't think he can lose. Leo thought about that. Then he smiled mischievously. He's gonna hate being wrong. Mara laughed quietly. That part might be true. They turned toward the door again. But before they could leave, voices echoed from the stairwell outside. Victor again. And Claudine. I don't care how long she's lived here, Victor was saying sharply. She's gone in 72 hours. Claudine's voice stayed calm. The paperwork is airtight. Good. Leo whispered, he's really sure. Mara listened silently. Victor continued speaking. The press event is tomorrow afternoon. Investors, city council, everyone. Leo's eyes widened again. Press event? Mara's gaze sharpened. Victor's voice grew confident again. We announce the redevelopment, celebrate the acquisition, and make it very clear the last tenant is leaving, Claudine replied smoothly. A public statement of authority, Victor chuckled. Exactly. Footsteps moved away up the stairs. The boiler room fell quiet again. Leo stared at Mara. You heard that, right? Yes. The press event is tomorrow, she nodded slowly. Leo looked at the blueprint tube over her shoulder. That's when you're going to show him. Mara stepped toward the door. Yes. Leo grinned. In front of everybody, she pushed the door open. And in front of the only audience that matters, Leo followed her up the stairs. Who's that? Mara glanced toward the glowing lobby above. The people he was trying to impress. Leo laughed softly. Victor Halbrecht didn't know it yet, but the stage he'd built for his victory was about to become something very different. And tomorrow afternoon, the quiet girl he tried to evict would be standing right in the center of it. The stairwell door creaked open as Mara and Leo stepped back into the dim maintenance corridor. The marble lobby glowed at the far end like a stage under bright lights. Voices carried easily down the hall. Victor Halbrecht still speaking with investors, their confident laughter echoing against polished stone. Leo leaned against the wall and whispered, "He really thinks this is already over." Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied the blueprint tube resting against her shoulder. The worn cardboard had traveled with her through years of small apartments, late-night moves, and quiet promises she made to her father's memory. Inside it was more than drawings. Inside it was proof. She glanced toward the lobby again. Victor was standing beside a holographic model of the future tower, pointing at glass penthouses and rooftop gardens. The investors nodded eagerly, already imagining the profits. Leo followed her gaze. That's where the press thing will be? Yes. And that's where you'll show the claws? Yes. Leo grinned nervously. This is going to be good. Before Mara could respond, a slow set of footsteps approached from the opposite hallway. Samuel Ortega appeared carrying a battered toolbox, his gray mustache twitching with concern. He stopped when he saw them. You two still here? Of course, Mara said gently. Samuel looked past them toward the bright lobby. That developer's already planning demolition routes, he muttered. Leo frowned. Demolition routes? Means they're studying where to break the building first. Samuel wiped grease from his hands with a rag. They think the structure's simple. Like any other old apartment block, Mara tilted her head slightly. And it isn't? Samuel snorted softly. Your father designed this place. He tapped a nearby concrete wall. Half these support lines are hidden. Smart engineering confuses anyone who didn't build it. Leo beamed with pride. See? Dad was a genius. Samuel smiled faintly at the boy. That he was, his eyes drifted to the blueprint tube. You still keeping those drawings? Mara nodded. Always. Samuel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen, that man out there? Victor Halbrecht? Yes, he's powerful. People like him don't usually lose. Mara met his gaze calmly. They lose when they misunderstand something important. Samuel studied her face. For a moment, something in his expression shifted. Recognition. Your father used to say that, he murmured. Leo looked between them. What did he mean? Samuel leaned against the wall. Your dad believed buildings had rules. Structural rules. Legal rules. Design rights. He tapped the blueprint tube gently, and sometimes those rules outlive the people who wrote them. Mara didn't reply, but her silence confirmed enough. Samuel straightened slowly. You found something in the archives, didn't you? Leo's excitement nearly burst out. She found a clause. Mara shot him a soft look. Leo clamped his mouth shut. Samuel's eyebrows rose. A clause? Maybe, Mara said carefully. Samuel chuckled. Your father loved clauses. Leo blinked. Why? Because they hide in contracts like landmines, Samuel explained. Everyone reads the big paragraphs. Nobody reads the last lines. Mara smiled faintly. That sounds familiar. Samuel glanced toward the lobby again, where Victor's voice grew louder. City council approvals are already underway. The superintendent shook his head. He's moving fast. That's why tomorrow matters, Mara said quietly. Samuel studied her. You planning something? Just telling the truth. Samuel nodded slowly. Truth's a dangerous thing in front of investors. Leo couldn't hide his grin. That's the point. Samuel laughed under his breath. You really are your father's daughter. For a moment the corridor fell silent. Then the elevator doors at the far end slid open. Claudine Voss stepped out, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her eyes landed on the small group instantly. Well, she said smoothly. Still here? Samuel muttered something under his breath and walked past her toward the boiler room. Claudine didn't acknowledge him. Her attention stayed on Mara. You've been busy tonight. Maintenance work. Of course. Claudine's gaze drifted to the blueprint tube again. You seem very attached to those drawings. They belong to my father. I assumed as much. Claudine stepped closer, her voice calm and professional. You should consider accepting the buyout before tomorrow. Leo crossed his arms. Why? Claudine smiled politely at him. Because public embarrassment rarely benefits anyone. Mara tilted her head slightly. That sounds like advice. It is. Thank you. Claudine studied her face carefully. You're very calm for someone about to lose her home. Mara's voice stayed soft. I'm calm because I understand this building. Claudine's smile tightened just a little. And Mr. Halbrecht doesn't? He understands money. Claudine folded her arms. Money usually wins, not always. Claudine's eyes flicked toward the archive hallway. You found something down there. Mara didn't answer. But silence often speaks louder than words. Claudine sighed lightly. Well, if you're planning a dramatic moment tomorrow, I'd reconsider. Why? Because contracts are very precise things. Mara nodded slowly. I agree. Claudine studied her for another second. Then she turned and walked back toward the elevator. Before stepping inside, she glanced over her shoulder. 72 hours, she reminded. The doors closed with a soft metallic sigh. Leo exhaled loudly. She definitely knows something's up. Mara looked toward the lobby again. Victor's investors were beginning to leave. Tomorrow afternoon the room would be full of cameras instead. The perfect audience. Leo tugged her sleeve. So, what now? Mara adjusted the blueprint tube on her shoulder. Now we prepare. Leo grinned. For the press event? Yes. And the clause? Yes. Leo's excitement bubbled again. Victor Halbrecht believed tomorrow would be the day he proved his power. But somewhere inside the old building, buried beneath decades of paperwork and steel beams, waited a single forgotten sentence, a sentence that could stop everything. And tomorrow, everyone in that lobby was going to hear it. The elevator doors had barely closed behind Claudine Voss when Leo exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She knows, he whispered. Mara leaned against the hallway wall for a moment, listening to the building. Pipes hummed faintly somewhere above them. The old structure had its own quiet rhythm, a pulse she'd learned to read years ago. Maybe, she said calmly. Leo crossed his arms. That lawyer definitely suspects something. Suspicion isn't proof, and proof is the clause. Mara nodded once. The clause is the beginning. Leo blinked. The beginning of what? She pushed herself off the wall and started walking toward the archive again, of understanding what it really means. Leo hurried after her. You already read it. I read the words. And now I need to read the context. The archive door creaked open again as they stepped inside. Dust swirled in the yellow light like drifting smoke. Mara placed the blueprint tube carefully on the table and pulled the folded clause from the folder. Leo leaned over the paper as she smoothed it flat. Okay, he said, squinting. Explain it again. She traced the lines with one finger. This clause connects three things, she said quietly. The design rights, the structural authority, and the architect's heir. Leo pointed at the signature at the bottom. That's Dad, yes, and the heir is you. Yes, Leo grinned. So that means Victor can't demolish the building. Not exactly. The grin faded slightly. What do you mean, not exactly? Mara picked up the blueprint and unrolled it beside the document. The drawing showed the building's skeleton, steel beams, weight loads, support columns hidden behind walls. Look here, she said, pointing to a series of reinforced support points. Leo leaned closer. These hold the entire central structure, and these, she continued, tracing another line, connect to the structural modification rights. Leo blinked. You're losing me. She smiled gently. The clause doesn't just protect the building. What does it protect? The design. Leo frowned. But that's the building. Not always. She tapped the blueprint lightly. Architectural design rights mean no one can alter the structure without approval from the designer, or the designer's heir. Leo's eyes widened slowly. So if Victor wants to turn this into luxury apartments, he has to redesign parts of the building, and if he redesigns it, he needs permission. Leo's mouth slowly opened. Your permission. Mara rolled the blueprint halfway closed again. Yes. Leo stared at the paper like it had just turned into gold. So he literally bought a building he can't change. She gave a small nod. If the clause holds up, Leo laughed quietly. He's going to explode. Possibly. Leo leaned back against the table, still grinning. That press event tomorrow is going to be incredible. Mara studied the document again. Only if we present it properly. What do you mean? Lawyers will try to twist it. Leo frowned. But it's written right there. Contracts are battles fought with details. Leo groaned. So we need backup. Exactly. She folded the clause carefully and slipped it back into the folder. Leo looked up at her. Who do we show it to first? Someone who understands construction law. Do we know anyone like that? Mara thought for a moment. Then a name surfaced from memory. Samuel. Leo blinked. The superintendent? He worked with my father during construction. And you think he'll understand the clause? Better than anyone. Leo nodded slowly. Okay, that makes sense. She rolled the blueprint back into the tube. The cardboard slid shut with a soft whisper. Leo watched her secure the cap. You really think tomorrow changes everything? She looked at him. Tomorrow forces the truth into the open. Leo smiled again. That's basically the same thing. She placed the tube over her shoulder. Come on. They stepped back into the hallway. Samuel was just emerging from the boiler room, wiping grease from his hands again. He looked surprised to see them returning. You two digging through the archives all night? Something like that, Mara said. Samuel studied her expression carefully. You find what you were looking for? Mara reached into the folder and held up the clause. Maybe. Samuel took the paper and adjusted his glasses. The hallway fell silent as he read. Leo bounced slightly on his heels while waiting. Samuel's eyebrows slowly rose higher. Then higher. Finally he lowered the paper and stared at Mara. Well, I'll be damned. Leo pumped his fist. See? Samuel looked toward the lobby instinctively, as if expecting Victor to appear again. This clause is real, he said quietly. Yes, and legally binding. That's what I thought. Samuel chuckled in disbelief. That billionaire just bought himself a very expensive problem. Leo laughed loudly. I knew it. Samuel shook his head. He's planning that big press event tomorrow, right? Yes. Samuel folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Then that's where you show it. That's the plan. Samuel looked impressed. Your father would have loved this. Leo grinned. Dad always said contracts were like traps. Samuel nodded. Your father designed this building to last 100 years. He glanced toward the lobby again. Looks like he also designed the perfect trap for anyone arrogant enough to forget that. Mara tucked the claws back into the blueprint tube. Her calm expression returned. Tomorrow afternoon the room would be full. Investors, city officials, reporters, and Victor Halbrecht standing proudly in front of them all. Samuel crossed his arms thoughtfully. You know, he said slowly, this might be the most satisfying legal surprise I've ever seen. Leo laughed. Just wait until Victor hears it. Samuel smiled faintly. Oh, I will. And if you're enjoying this moment as much as we are, make sure you subscribe with the bell on. Because the next step of this story is where the billionaire realizes his victory speech is about to become something very different. Mara looked toward the bright marble lobby once more. Tomorrow the powerful people of the city would gather there. And when they did, the quiet girl they tried to evict would be holding the one document that could stop everything. The quiet girl they tried to evict would be holding the one document that could stop everything. Samuel Ortega leaned against the hallway railing, still staring at the blueprint tube like it might suddenly reveal another surprise. I've worked in this building 30 years, he muttered. And I never knew your father put something like that in the contract. Mara adjusted the strap of the tube on her shoulder. Most people didn't. Leo rocked slightly on his heels, unable to hide his excitement. Victor's face tomorrow is going to be amazing. Samuel chuckled under his breath. Careful, kid. Powerful men don't enjoy being embarrassed. Leo shrugged. He started it. Samuel couldn't argue with that. From the lobby at the far end of the corridor came the faint clink of glasses. Investors were still celebrating the acquisition, unaware that the foundation of their celebration might already be cracking. Samuel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You sure you want to wait until the press event? Mara nodded. Yes, you could walk up there right now and show him the clause. That wouldn't change anything. Samuel frowned. Why not? Because he'd bury it. Leo blinked. Bury it? Mara leaned against the wall. Victor Halbrecht has lawyers, money, and influence. If I show him privately, the conversation disappears. Samuel slowly nodded. But if you show it publicly, then it becomes a fact everyone has to deal with. Leo grinned again. Like a trap, Samuel pointed at him. Exactly like a trap. For a moment the hallway grew quiet again. Then Samuel sighed and shook his head. You really are your father's daughter. Mara smiled faintly. I've heard that before. Samuel gestured toward the lobby. That man thinks this building is just another project. He's wrong, Samuel chuckled. Very wrong. Leo leaned closer to Mara. So what do we do until tomorrow? She thought for a moment. First, we make copies of the clause. Samuel nodded immediately. Good idea, and we document the original contract references. Even better, Leo raised a hand like a student in class. Why? Samuel answered before Mara could. Because when Victor's lawyers panic tomorrow, they'll try to challenge the document. Leo blinked. But they just read it. Samuel shrugged. Lawyers challenge everything. Mara pulled the clause from the tube again and handed it to Samuel. Can you access the office copier upstairs? Samuel grinned. I know every machine in this building. Good. Leo followed them down the corridor as they headed toward the maintenance office. The lights flickered slightly overhead. Construction crews were already tampering with electrical circuits. Samuel muttered, "They're rushing." Mara nodded. "Victor wants demolition permits approved quickly." They reached the small office near the stairwell. Inside sat an aging copier beside stacks of maintenance logs. Samuel switched on the machine. It whirred awake slowly, like an old engine clearing its throat. Leo leaned on the desk while Mara carefully placed the claws on the glass. The copier hummed. A moment later, the first copy slid out. Samuel examined it. Clear enough. Mara made 2 more copies. One went into Leo's backpack. Another Samuel folded into his jacket pocket. Leo blinked. "Why do you get one?" Samuel smiled. "Backup." Mara nodded approvingly. "Exactly." Leo slung the backpack over his shoulder proudly. "This feels like we're preparing for battle." Samuel laughed softly. "In a way we are." Mara rolled the original claws back into the blueprint tube. The cardboard clicked shut. Samuel watched her do it. "You realize something, right?" "What?" "Victor Halbrecht thinks tomorrow is his victory speech." Mara's calm eyes met his. "Yes." Samuel crossed his arms. "But tomorrow might become something else entirely." Leo grinned again. A disaster for him. Samuel shook his head slowly. Not just a disaster, a lesson. Leo tilted his head. "What kind of lesson?" Samuel looked down the hallway toward the glowing lobby, where Victor's voice echoed faintly once more. "The kind powerful people learn when they underestimate someone quiet." Mara walked toward the stairwell. "Let's get some rest," Leo groaned. "Rest? Tomorrow is the big day, yes. That's why we should celebrate." She opened the stairwell door. "Tomorrow requires a clear mind." Samuel nodded in agreement. "She's right, kid." Leo sighed dramatically. "Fine." They climbed the stairs together. The building creaked softly around them as if aware something important was coming. When they reached the landing near Mara's small service apartment, Leo paused. "Do you think Victor suspects anything yet?" Mara unlocked the door slowly. "Claudine suspects something." "But Victor?" She thought about the billionaire's confident smile earlier in the lobby. "He believes the story already ended." Leo grinned. "That's his mistake, yes." They stepped inside the modest apartment. The place was small but warm. 2 chairs, a narrow kitchen table, and stacks of old engineering books that once belonged to their father. Samuel paused in the doorway. "You know," he said thoughtfully. "Your father used to say, buildings reveal their secrets only when someone truly listens." Mara placed the blueprint tube carefully beside the table. "That sounds like him." Samuel nodded. "Well, tomorrow this building might reveal its biggest secret yet." Leo zipped open his backpack and checked the copied document again. Still there. Safe. He looked up at Mara. "You nervous?" She shook her head slowly. "No, why not?" Mara glanced toward the window overlooking the glowing city skyline, because tomorrow wasn't about fighting Victor Halbrecht. Tomorrow was simply about letting the truth stand in the middle of the room where everyone could see it. And once that happened, even the richest man in the city wouldn't be able to pretend it didn't exist. Even the richest man in the city wouldn't be able to pretend it didn't exist. Morning crept slowly into the building through narrow windows and dusty glass panes. Pale sunlight stretched across the worn kitchen table where the blueprint tube rested like a quiet witness. Mara was already awake. She stood beside the window studying the street below. Delivery trucks lined the curb, unloading equipment for the afternoon's press event. Leo shuffled out of the small bedroom, rubbing his eyes. "You didn't sleep, did you?" She turned slightly. "Enough." Leo glanced at the table. The tube was still there, the clause was still inside. "Today's the day," he said quietly. "Yes." He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "You think Victor slept?" Mara gave a small smile. "I'm sure he did. Why?" "Because he thinks today will go exactly the way he planned." Leo laughed softly. "That's almost sad." Down in the lobby, the sounds of preparation echoed faintly upward. Chairs scraped across marble floors. Microphones clicked on and off as technicians tested equipment. Samuel's voice floated briefly through the stairwell. "No, the podium goes near the main staircase." Leo peeked through the hallway door. "They're setting everything up." Mara slipped the blueprint tube over her shoulder. "Then we should go down soon." Leo's eyes sparkled. "I want to see Victor when he realizes." "Patience." He groaned. "You always say that, and it's always correct." A few minutes later, they stepped into the hallway. Samuel was adjusting rows of folding chairs in the lobby below, moving them with careful precision. Reporters were already arriving, their cameras hanging from their shoulders like metallic birds. The marble space looked completely different from the quiet building it had been yesterday. Today it looked like a stage. Samuel noticed them and waved them closer. "You're early." "Better than late," Mara replied. Leo scanned the room eagerly. "Where's Victor?" Samuel nodded toward a cluster of executives near the front entrance. Victor Halbrecht stood surrounded by advisors, his tailored suit flawless as always. He looked confident, relaxed, like a man preparing to celebrate success. Leo whispered, "He has no idea." Samuel chuckled quietly. "None at all." Victor noticed the small group then. His eyes landed on Mara instantly. He excused himself from the executives and walked toward them with measured steps. "Well," he said smoothly, "you're still here." Mara met his gaze calmly. "Yes." Victor glanced around the room. "Enjoying the event setup?" "It's impressive," he smiled. "By tonight, this building officially begins its transformation." Leo crossed his arms. "Maybe." Victor looked down at the boy with mild amusement. Optimism is admirable. His attention returned to Mara. "You had time to reconsider the buyout." She shook her head. "No," Victor sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Am I?" "Yes." He gestured toward the growing crowd of reporters. "This announcement will be public." "I understand. And afterward the eviction proceeds exactly as planned." Mara nodded slowly. "We'll see." Victor paused. Her calm tone again. No panic. No anger. Just certainty. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Claudine Voss approached then, tablet in hand. "Everything is ready," she told Victor. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Mara, then toward the blueprint tube. The suspicion from yesterday returned instantly. "You brought your drawings," she noted coolly. "They're important." Claudine studied her expression. "Important enough to change something today?" Mara simply smiled. "Possibly." Victor frowned slightly. "What exactly do you think is going to happen here?" "Truth," she said softly. Leo struggled not to grin. Victor gave a short laugh. "You're welcome to stay and watch the announcement." Claudine leaned closer to him and whispered something. Victor nodded and turned back toward the podium area. "Well," he said, "let's begin." The lobby lights brightened slightly as cameras switched on. Reporters filled the chairs Samuel had arranged. Investors gathered near the front row. City officials whispered among themselves. Samuel quietly moved to stand beside Mara and Leo. "This is it," he murmured. Leo clutched the strap of his backpack. Inside rested the copy of the clause. His heart raced. Victor stepped behind the podium. Microphones flickered with red lights. "Good afternoon," he began confidently. The room quieted instantly. "Today marks the beginning of an exciting redevelopment project for this historic building." Leo whispered, he said, "Historic." Samuel chuckled softly. Victor continued speaking. Our vision will transform this aging structure into modern luxury residences designed for the future of this city. Slides appeared on a large screen behind him. Glass towers, penthouse views, luxury amenities. Reporters scribbled notes. Investors nodded approvingly. Victor smiled proudly. And as part of that process, the final tenant will be vacating the property within 72 hours. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned slightly toward Mara. Victor gestured toward her. We appreciate her cooperation in allowing progress to continue. Leo whispered, Cooperation? Mara stepped forward slowly. Samuel's eyes widened slightly. This was earlier than expected. Victor noticed her movement. Is there something you'd like to add? He asked with polite sarcasm. The room grew very quiet. Mara reached for the blueprint tube. Her voice remained calm. Yes, she said. There is. Victor folded his arms. Well, by all means. Mara gently opened the tube. The paper slid out with a soft whisper. Cameras shifted toward her. Leo felt his heart pounding in his chest. Samuel leaned closer and murmured under his breath. Here we go. Samuel's quiet words barely left his mouth before the entire lobby shifted its attention toward the young woman standing a few feet from Victor Halbrecht's podium. Mara held the blueprint tube carefully, the cardboard edge worn from years of use. The room had gone silent in that strange way large crowds do when something unexpected interrupts a scripted event. Victor looked mildly amused. This is unusual, he said lightly into the microphone. But I suppose every press conference benefits from audience participation. A few investors chuckled. Cameras rotated toward the girl in work gloves standing in front of the billionaire developer. Leo's heart pounded so loudly he was certain the microphones might pick it up. Samuel whispered beside him, Study. Mara didn't rush. She slowly unrolled the large blueprint across the podium table beside Victor. The paper spread wide, revealing the skeletal structure of the building in careful architectural lines. Victor glanced down briefly. Historic drawings, he said with a smirk. Charming, but not exactly relevant to redevelopment. They are, she replied calmly. Claudine Voss stepped forward slightly, her expression tightening. Miss Ionescu, she said carefully, this is a scheduled announcement. If you have concerns, you may discuss them privately with our legal office. Mara didn't look at her. Private conversations don't change public facts. A low murmur moved through the reporters. Victor tapped the microphone once. Let's not turn this into theater. Leo almost laughed. Samuel crossed his arms quietly. Too late. Mara lifted a single sheet of paper from the blueprint tube. The clause, she held it carefully so the cameras could see. This building was designed by my father, she said calmly. Victor shrugged. Yes, we're aware of the architect, but the redevelopment team may not be aware of something written into the original structural contract. Claudine's eyes narrowed instantly. Victor tilted his head slightly. And what would that be? Mara placed the paper beside the blueprint. The reporters leaned forward in their chairs. The contract includes a structural modification clause, she explained. Victor chuckled. All buildings have modification clauses. This one is different. Claudine stepped closer to the podium. Miss Ionescu, if you're misunderstanding legal language, I'm not. The calm interruption stopped her. Victor's amusement faded just a fraction. Explain it then, he said. Mara tapped the clause gently. This clause states that any structural redesign of the building requires approval from the original architect. Victor folded his arms. That architect passed away years ago, yes, and therefore the clause no longer applies. She shook her head slowly. It transfers. Claudine froze. Victor's eyes sharpened slightly. Transfers to who? He asked. Mara looked directly at him, the architect's heir. A quiet wave of whispers moved through the crowd. Leo grinned beside Samuel. Victor shrugged again, though his tone had cooled. And you're suggesting what exactly? Mara lifted the paper so the cameras could clearly see the signature line. My father added a legal continuation clause. Claudine stepped forward quickly now. Let me see that. Mara handed her the document without resistance. Claudine scanned the page rapidly. Her confident expression cracked for the first time. Victor noticed immediately. Well, he asked. Claudine didn't answer right away. She reread the clause. Then she looked up slowly. This appears to grant structural approval rights to the architect's legal heir. Victor frowned. And? Claudine swallowed. And the heir would be? She looked directly at Mara. Her? A sharp ripple of surprise moved through the room. Reporters immediately began murmuring into recorders. Leo's grin widened. Victor's expression hardened. That's not possible, he said. The building belongs to me, yes, Mara said calmly. You purchased the property. Victor gestured toward the blueprint. Then this is irrelevant. Not if you want to change the structure. Claudine spoke quietly now. The clause specifically references structural redesign. Victor looked at her sharply. What does that mean? Claudine hesitated. It means demolition or major modification would legally require approval from the architect's heir. Victor's jaw tightened. You're telling me this girl can stop the redevelopment? Claudine lowered her voice. If the clause is valid, yes. The room buzzed with sudden excitement. Reporters raised cameras. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Samuel leaned toward Leo and whispered, That sound you hear? What? Victor Halbrecht realizing he should have read the contract. Leo almost laughed out loud. Victor stepped away from the podium now, studying Mara carefully. You planned this, he said. No, then why bring it here? Because you chose this room. He glanced at the reporters surrounding them. Of course you did. Mara's voice remained calm. You wanted everyone here to witness your victory. Victor's eyes narrowed. And now you want them to witness yours. I want them to witness the truth. Claudine quietly checked the document again. The clause was clear, the language precise. Victor exhaled slowly. Even if this clause exists, he said, it doesn't change ownership, no, but it does change authority. Victor studied the crowd of reporters now whispering excitedly. Samuel crossed his arms proudly. Leo could barely stand still. The stage Victor had prepared for celebration was turning into something very different. Before the tension could settle, Mara spoke again. By the way, if you're enjoying this moment, make sure you subscribe with the bell on, because the next part of this story is where the billionaire realizes just how expensive one overlooked sentence can become. Victor looked back at her. You're very confident. She rolled the blueprint slowly back into the tube. I understand this building. Victor's voice lowered slightly. And you think that gives you power? Mara met his gaze evenly. No, she placed the blueprint tube on the podium. The contract does. For a moment, the entire marble lobby stood perfectly still. Victor Halbrecht stared at the blueprint tube resting on the podium as if it had suddenly turned into something dangerous. Around him, the quiet hum of cameras and whispered conversations began to grow louder. Reporters leaned toward one another, already sensing a headline forming. Leo shifted excitedly beside Samuel. Did you see his face? He whispered. Samuel chuckled under his breath. Oh, I saw it. Victor slowly stepped closer to the podium again. His confidence hadn't vanished, but the easy smile he wore earlier had faded. He reached for the document in Claudine's hand. Let me see that. Claudine hesitated only a moment before handing it over. Victor scanned the clause quickly. Then again, his jaw tightened slightly. The language was simple, precise, impossible to misread. Leo watched carefully. "He's realizing it," the boy whispered. Samuel nodded. "Yes, he is." Victor lowered the paper slowly and looked back at Mara. "You expect me to believe this prevents redevelopment? It prevents structural modification without approval." "That's not the same thing, no," she agreed calmly. "It's worse." A ripple of laughter moved quietly through a few reporters. Victor shot them an irritated glance. He turned back to Claudine. "This clause can't override property ownership. It doesn't," she admitted quietly. "Then what exactly does it do?" Claudine chose her words carefully. "It gives the architect's heir authority over structural design alterations." Victor exhaled sharply. "And demolition?" Claudine looked at the blueprint again. "That would qualify." A murmur moved through the investors now. The celebration from earlier had turned into uneasy whispers. Victor placed the document on the podium. "You're telling me that after purchasing this entire property," Claudine didn't interrupt, "I need permission from her to proceed?" Samuel whispered to Leo, "That's exactly what she's telling him." Leo tried not to laugh again. Victor turned toward Mara. "Do you realize how absurd this sounds?" "No. You're a maintenance worker. I maintain the building." Victor gestured toward the blueprints. "You're claiming authority over a multi-million-dollar project because of a line in a contract written decades ago. Not claiming, then what? Demonstrating." The calm answer hung in the air like a weight. Victor glanced at the crowd. Every camera in the room was now pointed directly at them. The reporters smelled blood in the water. Leo leaned closer to Samuel. "Everyone's watching now." Samuel nodded. "That's exactly what she wanted." Victor rubbed his temple briefly. "Even if this clause exists," he said slowly, "we can challenge it, of course. You seem very relaxed about that." "I am." Victor studied her expression again. No fear, no hesitation, the same steady confidence she'd carried since the moment he met her. It irritated him deeply. "You've been planning this for days," he said. "Years." That answer surprised him. Victor glanced down at the blueprint tube again. "Your father designed this building." "Yes." "And he inserted a clause that could block future redevelopment." "Yes." Victor gave a short laugh. "That's incredibly inconvenient." Samuel muttered quietly, "You have no idea." One of the investors near the front row raised his hand nervously. "Mr. Halbrecht, does this affect the timeline?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Claudine did. "It may require legal review." The room erupted into louder conversation. Investors whispered urgently. Reporters began firing questions. Is the project delayed? Did the development team overlook this clause? Who approved the purchase contract? Victor held up his hand. "Everyone relax." The room quieted slightly. He turned toward Mara again. "Let's assume this clause is valid." "That's a good assumption." Victor ignored the comment. "Then we simply negotiate." Leo frowned slightly. "Negotiate?" Samuel whispered, "Watch carefully." Victor straightened his jacket. "Miss Ionescu," he said smoothly. "You clearly want something. I want the building protected. That's not realistic. It is if the contract requires my approval." Victor exhaled slowly. "Everything has a price." Leo rolled his eyes. Samuel chuckled. Victor stepped closer to her now, lowering his voice so only the nearby microphones caught it. "I can make you very comfortable." Mara shook her head once. "I'm already comfortable." Victor's patience began to crack. "You're standing in the way of a development worth hundreds of millions. I'm standing where the contract says I can." Victor looked toward Claudine again. There must be a workaround. Claudine's expression remained careful. "We could attempt litigation." "How long?" "Months, possibly years." Victor glanced around the lobby. The cameras, the reporters, the investors watching nervously. The press event that had been meant to celebrate his victory was slowly turning into a public negotiation. Exactly the situation Mara had wanted. Samuel leaned toward Leo again. See what she did? Leo nodded eagerly. She made it public. Which means he can't bury it. Victor looked back at Mara. You've put me in a very awkward position. That wasn't my goal. Then what was? She met his gaze calmly. To make sure the building survives, Victor studied her silently for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled, but it wasn't the confident smile from earlier. This one carried a hint of respect. Well, he said slowly, looks like the quiet maintenance worker just stopped a demolition. Leo pumped his fist quietly. Samuel grinned. Victor folded the clause again and placed it carefully on the podium. Congratulations, he said. You've officially complicated my day. Mara didn't react. But the entire lobby understood something clearly now. Victor Halbrecht had walked into the room expecting to announce the future. Instead, he had just discovered that the future of the building might belong to the quiet girl he tried to evict. The silence inside the marble lobby stretched longer than anyone expected. Victor Halbrecht stood behind the podium, one hand resting on the folded clause. The room that had been prepared for applause and celebration now hummed with something else: uncertainty. Reporters whispered rapidly into microphones. Investors exchanged worried glances. Leo could barely keep still beside Samuel. He really didn't see that coming, the boy whispered. Samuel shook his head slowly. No, he didn't. Victor finally picked up the microphone again. Well, he said, forcing a calm tone, this is certainly an interesting development. A few nervous chuckles drifted through the audience. He looked toward Mara again. You've presented a clause that may affect structural redesign. Correct. But ownership still belongs to my company. Yes, Victor nodded slightly. So let's keep things in perspective. He turned toward the reporters. This situation is simply a legal technicality. It will be reviewed and resolved accordingly. Claudine stepped closer, speaking quietly to him. We should pause the announcement. Victor's jaw tightened. Not yet. But the reporters were already raising their hands. Mr. Halbrecht, one called out, does this mean demolition cannot begin? Another voice followed. Did your legal team miss this clause during acquisition? Victor's patience began to thin. This building will still be redeveloped, he said firmly. Mara spoke gently from beside the podium. Not without approval. Victor glanced sideways at her. You're very confident in that document. It's legally binding. Claudine cleared her throat. It appears to be. The room buzzed again. Samuel leaned toward Leo. This is the part where the investors get nervous. Leo watched the front row. Several investors were already whispering urgently to each other. Victor noticed too. He stepped away from the podium and approached Mara directly. The microphones followed every word. Let's talk plainly, he said. All right. You're standing between me and a project worth hundreds of millions, yes. And you're doing it with one sentence in a contract, yes. Victor folded his arms. You realize what that means, that you should have read the contract. A ripple of laughter moved through the reporters. Victor didn't laugh, but he didn't look angry anymore either. He looked thoughtful. He studied the blueprint tube again. You understand the structure of this building better than anyone here, yes. And your father designed it. Yes. Victor glanced toward the towering blueprint behind them. Which means this clause wasn't accidental, no. Samuel murmured quietly to Leo. He's figuring it out. Leo whispered back. Figuring out what? That her father planned ahead. Victor looked back at Mara. Your father expected someone like me to buy the building someday. He expected someone to try to change it. And he wanted his design protected, yes. Victor rubbed his chin slowly. That's actually impressive. Claudine looked surprised by the comment. So do we fight it? She asked quietly. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the lobby, the cameras, the investors, the reporters capturing every second. Then he looked back at Mara. You care about the building, yes. You're not doing this for money, no? Leo grinned proudly. Samuel nodded in approval. Victor exhaled slowly. Well, that complicates my negotiation strategy. Mara tilted her head slightly. You expected me to sell? Most people would. I'm not most people. He smiled faintly. That's becoming clear. The reporters scribbled furiously now. This was turning into a story much bigger than a simple eviction. Victor walked back to the podium. The claws still rested on the table beside the blueprint. He tapped the microphone again. It appears, he said slowly, that our redevelopment project requires additional legal review. The investors shifted uneasily. But, he continued, I also believe every obstacle presents an opportunity. Samuel whispered to Leo. Now he's thinking like a businessman again. Leo frowned slightly. What does that mean? Means he's looking for a new angle. Victor gestured toward Mara. Miss Ionescu clearly has authority over structural changes to the building. Yes, and she clearly cares about its future. Mara watched him carefully. Victor smiled slightly. So perhaps the smartest path forward is collaboration. The room erupted with surprised murmurs. Leo blinked. Collaboration? Samuel chuckled quietly. Didn't see that coming. Victor continued speaking. Instead of removing the architect's legacy, perhaps we preserve it. He looked directly at Mara. You protect the building's design, and you profit from it. Victor shrugged. Everyone wins. Claudine looked thoughtful now. That might actually stabilize investor confidence. One reporter raised a hand. Mr. Halbrecht, are you suggesting a partnership with the tenant you plan to evict? Victor smiled again. I'm suggesting we respect the contract. Leo nudged Samuel. He just switched sides. Samuel nodded. Powerful people adapt quickly. Victor extended his hand toward Mara. So, he said, do we keep fighting in court for years, or do we build something better together? The lobby waited. Cameras pointed forward. Investors leaned closer. The billionaire developer who tried to remove her was now offering something very different, and everyone in the room wanted to see what the quiet girl would say next. For several seconds, Mara didn't move. Victor Halbrecht's hand remained extended in the center of the marble lobby, the gesture frozen beneath a dozen bright camera lights. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Investors shifted uneasily, sensing that whatever happened in the next moment might decide the future of the entire project. Leo held his breath beside Samuel. Is she actually thinking about it? He whispered. Samuel nodded slowly. She's thinking about the building. Victor spoke again, his voice calm but firm. You have authority over structural changes, he said. That gives you leverage. Mara studied his outstretched hand but didn't take it yet. And you have ownership of the property, she replied quietly. That gives you control. Victor nodded. So, we both have something the other needs. The reporters scribbled faster. Claudine watched closely, her sharp eyes shifting between them. What exactly would collaboration mean? Mara asked. Victor lowered his hand slightly but didn't withdraw it. It means preserving the structural design your father created. And redesigning the interior with your approval. Samuel crossed his arms thoughtfully. That's actually not a bad offer, he murmured to Leo. Leo frowned. But he still wanted to tear it down. Samuel shrugged. Plans change when contracts speak louder than money, Victor continued. This building stays standing, he said. The original architecture remains intact, and the redevelopment happens within those boundaries. Mara glanced around the room. Investors watched carefully now, hopeful the situation might stabilize. Reporters waited for a dramatic answer. Leo whispered again. "You're going to say yes, right?" She didn't respond. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the tall windows overlooking the city. For a moment, the noise of the room faded. She remembered evenings sitting at the kitchen table while her father sketched the building's design. The pride in his voice. The way he described the structure like it was alive. "This building," he once said, "is meant to outlast all of us." Samuel noticed the distant look in her eyes. "She's remembering him," he said quietly. Leo nodded. Victor waited patiently. He understood that moment now. This wasn't just business for her. It was legacy. Finally, Mara looked back at him. "If the structure stays exactly as it was designed," she said, "it does. If the historic architecture is protected, yes. And if the building continues to serve the community that lives around it," Victor tilted his head. "What do you mean by that? No luxury tower that pushes everyone out." The investors shifted nervously again. Victor considered her words. "You're asking for affordable housing units inside the redevelopment, yes." Claudine leaned toward him and whispered something quickly. Victor listened. Then he nodded slowly. "That could work." Leo's eyes widened. "Wait, really?" Samuel chuckled. "Looks like she's negotiating now." Victor looked back at Mara. "You want the building protected?" "Yes." "You want the community included?" "Yes." "And you want the architect's legacy respected?" "Yes." Victor extended his hand again. "Then we might actually be on the same side." The room grew quiet once more. Mara studied him for another moment. Then, finally, she reached forward. Her grease-stained work glove met the billionaire's polished hand. The handshake sent a visible ripple through the audience. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered excitedly. Leo pumped his fist quietly. Samuel smiled with quiet pride. Victor looked toward the crowd. "Well," he said, "it appears today's announcement has changed slightly." A few reporters laughed. Claudine stepped forward beside him. "The redevelopment project will now proceed with structural preservation under the approval of the architect's heir." She gestured toward Mara. "Meaning this building's original design will remain intact." Another reporter raised his hand. "So the tenant you plan to evict now controls the design approval?" Victor nodded. "Yes." The reporter grinned. "That's quite a twist." Victor smiled faintly. "It's also good business." Samuel leaned toward Leo again. "See that?" Leo nodded. He's respecting her now. That's what happens when someone proves their worth. Victor turned back toward Mara. "You could have sold that clause quietly," he said. "Yes, why didn't you?" "Because the building deserved better than a quiet deal." Victor gave a small nod of understanding. The investors were already beginning to relax now. Some even looked impressed. One elderly city official stepped forward. "This is the kind of preservation project our community needs." Applause began slowly, then spread through the room. Leo's grin stretched from ear to ear. Dad would have loved this. Samuel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. He absolutely would have. Victor glanced toward the blueprint tube resting on the podium. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "your father didn't just design a building." Mara tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Victor smiled slightly. "He designed the future conversation we're having right now." Mara looked down at the blueprint. For the first time since the confrontation began, her calm expression softened. Because Victor Halbrecht was finally beginning to understand something the building had known all along. The quiet girl he tried to remove had never just been a tenant. She had always been the architect's daughter. The applause in the marble lobby lasted longer than anyone expected. Reporters continued snapping photos as Victor Halbrecht and the quiet maintenance girl stood side by side near the podium. Only hours earlier, he had planned to celebrate her eviction. Now the same room was celebrating a partnership that nobody in the city had seen coming. Leo clapped the loudest. Samuel leaned against the back row of chairs, smiling with the slow satisfaction of someone who had watched the entire storm unfold exactly as it should. "Your father would have been proud," he said quietly. Mara looked down at the blueprint tube resting on the podium. The worn cardboard looked small compared to the towering building around them. But inside it lived the design that had just changed everything. Victor adjusted the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today's announcement has evolved into something far better than we originally planned." A few reporters laughed. He gestured toward Mara. "This building will be redeveloped with its original structural design preserved." Murmurs of approval spread through the audience, and thanks to the architect's heir, he continued, will ensure the legacy of its creator remains intact. Leo leaned closer to Samuel. "He's being really respectful now." Samuel nodded. "That's what happens when arrogance meets reality." Victor stepped away from the podium and turned toward Mara again. "You surprised me today," he admitted. "That wasn't the goal." No, the goal was protecting the building." Victor chuckled lightly. "Well, you did that very effectively." Claudine approached with a small folder of notes. "The investors are actually responding positively," she said. Victor raised an eyebrow. "They are?" "Yes. Historic preservation projects often attract more long-term interest." Victor smiled faintly. "Then perhaps this clause was good luck." Mara shook her head gently. "It wasn't luck." Victor glanced at the blueprint again. "Your father?" "Yes." Samuel spoke from the back of the room. "That man thought about everything." Victor nodded thoughtfully. Clearly. The reporters began packing their equipment now, already discussing the unexpected headline. One of them approached Mara. "Miss Ionescu," the reporter said, "what made you stand up to someone like Victor Halbrecht?" She considered the question carefully. Then she answered simply, "Because some things shouldn't disappear just because someone rich wants them to." The reporter nodded with a smile. "That's a powerful answer." Leo tugged her sleeve. "You did it. We did it." Samuel stepped forward. "The building did it too." Victor looked around the lobby one more time. The old marble columns, the tall windows, the quiet strength of a structure designed decades earlier. "Your father built something special," he said. Mara followed his gaze across the room. "Yes. And thanks to that clause, it will still be standing long after today." Outside, the city moved on like it always did. Cars passed. People hurried down sidewalks. Most of them had no idea that inside the old building, a single sentence in a forgotten contract had just changed the fate of an entire property. Leo looked up at his sister. "So what happens now?" Mara rested the blueprint tube against her shoulder again. "Now we rebuild the inside." "But the outside stays the same." "Yes," Samuel grinned. "That's how you honor good architecture." Victor extended his hand one last time. "Looks like we're partners." Mara shook it calmly. "Looks like it." The lobby slowly emptied as the afternoon sun poured through the tall windows. But the building itself felt different now. Alive, protected, just as its architect had intended. And somewhere, if anyone had been listening closely enough, they might have heard the quiet echo of a father's design still holding the walls together. Not just steel and concrete, but legacy. A reminder that the quiet people the world overlooks sometimes carry the most powerful truths of all. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one line in the fine print. Ask me for the next story title, and we'll turn it into another powerful story like this. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story, You Clean Floors, Not Engines. The CEO mocked the single dad. 12 minutes later, the jet was airborne. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?